Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ashley Breath. I am a Staff Services Manager 2 in the Forensic Services Division of the Department of State Hospitals, and I will be moderating today's webinar. During our time together here today, our panelists will be discussing the latest research in the incompetent to stand trial population, the new and expanding programs our department has received funding for this year to help address the incompetent to stand trial crisis, and relevant changes to the penal code and welfare and institutions codes related to this population. Our panelists will be taking questions during the last half of the webinar. Just so you all know, today's meeting is being recorded and we will be posting this to DSH's public website in the near future. When we reach the end of our panelists' presentations, we will open up the Q&A function for you all to use. Once that Q&A function has been activated, you will see an icon with a question mark in the bottom center of your screen, circled here on the slide. All you have to do is click that icon to open up your Q&A, type in your question, and send to the all panelist option. Because of the size of today's meeting, all attendees have been muted on entry and will remain on mute throughout the webinar. However, if we need to call on you to clarify a question that you have submitted to us, please use the raise hand function so that we can quickly find and unmute you. The raise hand button can be found by clicking on the icon in the bottom center of your screen with the vertical ellipses and then selecting raise hand. Once you have been called on and have spoken, you will need to follow the same steps to lower your hand. My teammate Lisa Pedlar will be assisting me with muting and unmuting speakers during this time. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. And now I will turn the presentation over to our director, Stephanie Clendenin, for her opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our information session about the strategies and programs that the Department of State Hospitals has been funded for in this fiscal year to help meet the demands of the increasing referrals to the department of individuals who have been found incompetent to stand trial on felony charges. We are excited to have such a large, diverse audience of county partners, justice partners, providers, and community stakeholders joining us today to learn more about these initiatives and partnership opportunities. Over the last decade, the department has been challenged by the growing number of individuals who are being found incompetent to stand trial on felony charges and referred to the department for restoration of competency treatment. The department has responded with many efforts to increase capacity over the years, both in our state hospitals and through partnerships with many of you who are on the call today. We have worked to streamline and make systems improvements to reduce lengths of stay and maximize bed utilization. And we've conducted research to better understand the issue and to identify new solutions and opportunities to reduce demand. Ultimately, despite all of these efforts, the rates of referrals have continued to outpace our response. In addition to this longstanding challenge, most recently, like many healthcare facilities, congregate living environments, our jails and prisons, the COVID-19 pandemic has presented a significant challenge for our system. Here at DSH, we have had to implement a number of safeguards, operational changes, infection control measures to protect our patients and staff, which has lessened our ability to maximize bed utilization as we have in the past. Additionally, with each surge of the pandemic, our hospitals, as well as the jails who receive ISTs from, have become challenged with the outbreaks, which further creates difficulties for admissions and discharges of ISTs into our system. The pandemic has exacerbated our waitlist challenge, and we have seen a significant growth in the waitlist since the beginning of the pandemic. Finally, the department has faced significant litigation regarding wait time to admissions, and while this litigation is on appeal with the California Supreme Court, there are individuals who are not getting timely access to treatment as a result of the longstanding challenges and the pandemic impacts. All of these circumstances have led to this year's budget, which has provided an unprecedented $370.5 million to increase capacity primarily through increasing partnerships through these funding opportunities. Additionally, $75 million is available for future solutions that are yet to be identified. Our goal today is to provide you with an overview of the initiatives, new programs, and an expansion of partnership opportunities that this budget supports. Now, before I turn it over to our first presenter, Dr. Kate Warburton, I would be remiss if I didn't recognize the Herculean effort it is to put on one of these webinars. So I really want to take a moment to thank Ashley Breath and Lisa Pedler, who are behind the scenes, our expert webinar planners, and are doing all of the work to manage today's webinar. So thank you to you both. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Warburton.
Thank you, Stephanie, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the research that we've done to try to understand the IST crisis. This is an hour-long talk in itself that I've tried to put onto one slide, but it's really important that we understand this point in time in the context of the history of people in state hospitals in the United States. Before the middle 1800s, people who had serious mental illnesses were kept in horrific and inhumane conditions. And in response to that, advocates in Europe and here in the United States started to push states to develop asylums, as they were called at that time, which are really, back then, asylum was a humane word. And this was probably the high point of the social treatment of individuals with serious mental illness in our country. By 1900, the number of patients in state hospitals grew exponentially and was becoming problematic because while the number of patients being referred increased, the resources and facilities did not. In 1923, a seminal paper was published by Lionel Penrose, which essentially said that societies around the world who had large numbers of folks in their mental health system had fewer folks in their correctional system and vice versa. Those societies that incarcerated a lot of people in jails and prisons had fewer numbers of people in their mental health system, and that's known as the Penrose theory or the balloon theory. By 1955, there were over 500,000 people in state hospitals around the country. It was scandalous. There were media exposés, there were movies made about it, and something had to be done. The conditions were inhumane and it was extraordinarily expensive. Between that era and now, the process of deinstitutionalization occurred. And that was due to multiple things, things like the LPS Act, things like the creation or the discovery of antipsychotic medication, all of which led to people leaving state hospitals for community treatment. However, in the early 70s, people started writing into the academic journals, noticing that people who were formerly in the state hospital system were winding up in jails and prisons. In 1972, here in California, Dr. Abramson wrote a letter to an academic journal stating that he'd worked at a state hospital. The state hospital closed. He was now in the county jail, and he was seeing all of his patients from the state hospital ending up in the jail. And he put some data around that showing a 100% increase in mental health arrests over a period of 2 years. Sosowski did something similar in '78, showing that former state hospital patients had a markedly higher incidence of arrest. And in a very interesting paper, this is an esoteric paper that we just happened to come across during one of our lit searches, but in 1988, there was a paper published that was a warning that the IST commitment, or this forensic commitment, could become the new civil commitment that we saw used and abused the century before. And in 2010, I think most people are familiar with Fuller Torrey's work and the often repeated refrain that Twin Towers in LA, Crooks County Jail in Chicago, and Rikers Island in New York house more psychiatric patients than any other psychiatric institutions in the country. So this is where we find ourselves with this somewhat cyclical nature of the way a society treats people who have serious mental illnesses. And I have a whole talk. This is international. This has happened all around the world. Next slide. Actually, you can just pull these up as I'm talking. This is not a scientific slide. These are all just newspaper headlines from around the country showing that states all over the country are experiencing the same types of IST crises that we're experiencing here in California, and having the resultant issues with individuals backing up into jails where they're not getting the level of treatment necessary to deal with their serious mental illness. This was a great project, and this was a quantitative examination of the increases in forensic patients in state hospitals done by the NASHPD Research Institute. And essentially what it shows is that, next slide, I believe, there was a 74% increase in the number of forensic patients in state hospitals, and it was largely driven by a 72% increase in the number of IST patients in state hospitals. And it's important to note, 2014 is really when the crisis started. Our surge really began in earnest in 2014. There are no national data right now, but they're working on it. And my very strong hypothesis is we're going to see an explosion nationally of IST patients over the last 7 years. We feel this even more acutely in California because we treat so many forensic patients. We treat 44%, according to NASHPD 2015 state hospital profiles data. We treat 44% of all the forensic inpatients in the United States. When you take the next 4 highest states and combine them, they only treat 36%, and the rest of the country is only treating 20% of the forensic patients in the country. So while this is a national problem, it is there is no state experiencing it like we are here in California. Trueblood v. Washington is kind of the canary in the coal mine in terms of what happens when a state hospital system is unable to accommodate massive increases in IST referrals. This was one of the first litigated suits where the state was sued in federal court for not getting folks into their state hospital for IST services timely. And so essentially what came down in 2015 was a mandate that they needed to admit patients found incompetent to stand trial within 7 to 14 days. But as you can see from this slide, I hope you can see from this slide, the top black bar is the referrals over time into the Washington State Hospital system for restoration and IST services. And at the time Trueblood was decided, they had 3,400 referrals. And by 2019, they had 6,100 referrals, almost double the number of referrals. There is a little blip there, 2020 data. You'll see the same thing in our data. That was really related to COVID and the courts shutting down for a large period of time, so that we just didn't get as many IST referrals in 2020 in state hospital systems. But you can see in Washington, it's impossible to speed up the admissions of people found incompetent to stand trial if your referrals are doubling. So what's happened in Washington as a result of not being able to get people in timely? Well, they've incurred over $100 million in contempt fines. And I think what Washington has shown us is that suing a state in federal court to solve a problem that they don't have control over doesn't really work. Since that time, I think people have realized that, and they've changed the settlement structure in the Trueblood case. You can find all this on their Trueblood website. They're very transparent. But the new settlement agreement supports improved access to appropriate behavioral health services to try to reduce the number of people entering the criminal justice system or decriminalizing mental illness. And there's a nice quote in there that I thought would be appropriate for this meeting from their former secretary, Cheryl Strange. And she said, in regard to True Blood, how we care for those with behavioral health disorders is a measure of our humanity as a state. Our work with our state, county, and local partners is never done. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to run through some research. Those of you who've spent time with us have seen a lot of this before, but it's an important context to understand some of the programs that we are working on. This is from a long-standing research project, and it's looked at thousands of people who've been admitted as incompetent to stand trial. This research was done by a professor at the University of California, Davis. And this slide is just showing you that throughout several years, while the IST crisis was developing, the diagnostic picture of our patient population did not change. We were trying to figure out, well, do we have more methamphetamine-induced psychotic disorders? Do we have less psychotic disorders? What's going on here? The top two bars are mirror images and reflect a change in our nomenclature when the DSM-4 changed to the DSM-5, but added together, the yellow and purple bar at the top are reflective of all patients that we had met with a diagnosis of a psychotic disorder, and they haven't changed over time, and it represents the vast majority of people that we're admitting to our hospitals. This slide in that large project was the most important finding when we went back over 7 years of IST admissions and a few thousand patients. And this really drove our research following this finding. And what Dr. McDermott, our research director from UC Davis, had done is she had coded every single IST admission based on their arrest history. And the top category was people who'd been arrested 15 or more times by the time they were admitted to us as a felony IST patient. And that number went from about 16% of all the people we were admitting to about 46% of the population that we were admitting over just a 5-year period. Next slide. So in that project, that NAPA project, and with that finding, we started looking at those arrests. And what we found when we looked at those arrests is they were arrests related to things like untreated psychosis and homelessness. So we did a statewide project where we interviewed and coded the records of every single incompetent to stand trial admission over a 2-month period. And what we found in that sample was that 47% of all the folks that we were admitting who'd been found incompetent to stand trial on a felony were unsheltered at the time of their arrest. That is, not in a shelter bed, not in their car, but on the open street. And we've followed that up with a sample coding over the last 2 years, and we've looked at over 4,000 individuals who've been admitted to us as incompetent to stand trial. And when you add in sheltered homelessness, the number goes up to about 65% of all the people that we're admitting as incompetent to stand trial were homeless at the time of their arrest. We then took that small statewide sample of about 400 people, and we did a data match with DHCS to look at Medi-Cal utilization data, and essentially found that 47% of the folks that we were admitting as felony IST restoration candidates hadn't received any mental health services in the community in the 6 months prior to their arrest, and those that had really were just utilizing emergency type of ED services. Next slide, please. So we began to develop a hypothesis, and our hypothesis was that people who are living with psychotic disorders in California are drifting into a condition of homelessness and untreated psychotic symptoms, and that the IST explosion is being largely driven by criminal arrests based on those two factors rather than any sort of criminogenic drivers. And to that end, I didn't have time today to show you some vignettes, but you will read the heartbreaking cases of individuals who are simply symptomatic. And because they're symptomatic, they're making people uncomfortable. And because they're homeless, they're symptomatic out in public, and police are being called. And based on that, they'll get some type of felony arrest charge that stems from that interaction. And so over the last year, we've spent a tremendous amount of time examining and coding the packets of people who are on our wait list. And this particular project is not done, but these are preliminary results. These are licensed psychiatrists doing additional training in forensic psychiatry, looked at about 190 people on our wait list and found that 47% of people kind of fit that profile, where they were psychotic. There was a nexus between their symptoms of psychosis and their arrest, and they would not be a substantial risk of danger once treated. If you have an individual whose behavior is being driven by psychotic symptoms and you stabilize those psychotic symptoms, the principles of violence risk assessment tell us that their risk level plummets. Next slide, please. We did a national survey in 2017. We got 50 out of 51 jurisdictions, including the District of Columbia, to respond to our survey. These were state mental health commissioners, medical directors like myself, state hospital directors, and the other category are statewide forensic directors, mostly. So we had a great response rate, and we asked a lot of questions about the IST crisis in their state. Next slide, please. And this is an hour-long talk in and of itself, but the bottom line is that 78% of respondents saw an increase in referrals for competency restoration in the 50 out of 51 U.S. jurisdictions. Now, at that time, this was 2017, 71% had a wait list and 39% were facing significant true blood level litigation because of that wait list. And I know from our own experiences and talking to my colleagues in other states that when we replicate this study, which we intend to do, those numbers are going to be higher. Next slide, please. We asked an opinion question of the respondents of that survey and just asked, what do you think is driving the IST crisis? Back then, we were just trying to get an understanding of why this was happening to people living with psychotic disorders. And these were the top 4 responses in a national survey from state mental health leaders about what they believed was driving the IST crisis in their state. Inadequate general mental health services, inadequate crisis services, inadequate numbers of inpatient psychiatric beds in the community, and inadequate assertive community treatment. Next. So again, our hypothesis is that individuals with schizophrenia spectrum disorders are drifting into an untreated, unsheltered condition. These conditions are leading to increased contact with police and criminal charges, and that this is most likely the driver for the recent 7-year surge of IST referrals into state hospitals. We've noted that building more beds doesn't fix the problem. We've been adding incredible capacity, and it seems that whenever we add capacity, the referrals tend to increase. And additionally, and this is a very important point, IST restoration doesn't do anything to interrupt the trajectory of criminalization that these patients are facing. The only thing that we are able to do for folks who are sent to us for IST restoration is to stabilize them long enough for them to understand the proceedings against them and to be able to cooperate with their attorney. And then we are statutorily obligated to send that person back to jail, where they are either released into the exact same conditions that precipitated their arrest, or they're incarcerated in prison, and then they're released with a felony charge. So what can we do about this? This is our question. That's all about the patient's lives. But the IST commitment does nothing to help public safety. The 3-year post-discharge recidivism rate is about 70% year over year for fiscal years 14-15 through 16-17. It's high. So these folks are not engaged with an intervention that's furthering a public safety goal, they're going right back out to the community. I think there's a sense that, well, once they're found IST, they're going to go to the state, they're going to go to the state hospital system or the prison, and at least they'll be off the streets. They go right back out onto the streets. At least almost 3/4 of them do, as you can see here. Next slide, please. We looked across 3 years of IST discharges. 15% of the people that we admitted in that cohort had just one single offense. And of those, 35% had their charges dropped. Once we went through this whole thing of them waiting to come in, sitting in jail, coming to us, being stabilized, 35% of them had their charges dropped. The 85% of the ISTs that we admitted who had more than one offense, 24% of those had their charges dropped. So this entire process of IST finding followed by competency restoration, in many cases, these folks are just ending right back up in their community. Next slide, please. With that, I would like to turn it over to our Deputy Director for Forensic Services, who has done incredible things to try to interrupt this cycle of criminalization and help these people on our wait list. So let me introduce Chris Edens. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kate, for that lovely introduction, and always educational to hear you talk about the history and kind of what we've done in the space of research around ISTs. So this is to share a little bit about what all of the wonderful strategies and investments that this administration has funded just in this year alone. Next slide, please. This is just a summary, 7 different strategies, right, totaling $370.5 million, and that's just this year. Several of these different programs do have an ongoing funding component that will provide that additional funding for operations in the future years. So we'll go through some of these today, or all of these today. Thank you. Next slide. So just to kind of frame these next 3 slides are really talking about solutions and strategies that DSH is sort of tackling, or the administration as a whole. And then there's another second set of slides that will really dive into more of the sort of partnership opportunities and funding that will be made available to the counties and or direct treatment providers. So first one, I just want to kind of touch on, because there is a funding component associated with that. In Welfare and Institutions Code 4147, that established a time-limited state-level advisory work group that encompasses representation from all of the various stakeholders around that have the part in the sort of IST commitment and the crisis. And this is a statewide work group that's going to be led by our Health and Human Services Agency, and the chair of the work group is our director, Stephanie Clendenin. And this work group, it's a very, again, aggressive timeline, short-lived work group, but the really goal is to come up with short, medium, and long-term solutions that can be very actionable solutions that can be implemented by these dates that are on this slide, short-term by April of next year. So again, very aggressive schedule, medium-term solutions by January 23, and then long-term solutions by January 24 and January 25. Our first work group meeting is actually next week. I think I saw the list of folks that are on today's webinar, and I see many of you who will actually be at next week's meeting. If you're interested in viewing the meeting, it is available and open to the public. So for more information, you can check out that link that is in the slides. But there has been $75 million set aside for any of those sort of viable solutions that are identified by this work group. So just wanted to touch on that. Next slide, please. This is really exciting. While this isn't directly tied to IST, it does speak to capacity. For those that don't know, our conditional release program, or CONREP as we call it, is really DSH's outpatient treatment program, primarily for individuals that are coming out of the state hospitals and into the community. And so we've been working for the last few years to really build out our continuum of care for this program. And in this year's budget, we have been funded a substantial amount to establish what we call a whole new level of care, of services for this population, or for CONREP. And that'll be 180 beds, sort of 3 regional programs, one in Northern California, Southern California, and then in the sort of Greater Bay Area. Really excited about this, where we'll develop residences and deliver services on site at those residences, as opposed to kind of our traditional model, which is a really outpatient clinic model, and folks have to go to that outpatient clinic to receive their services. So we'll be able to serve sort of a higher need population of primarily those that are not guilty by reason of insanity, as well as those offenders with mental health disorders. We also do have the opportunity to serve the IST population in these beds as well. In addition to the FACT program, we are still continuing to build out our continuum of care, and have partnered with a couple of providers to establish some programs in an IMD or a SNF-like setting. So for us, that really is still stepping down out of the state hospital in a more secured environment. And the whole purpose of moving them into this newer environment is to provide that sort of lower level of care, right? But also to really focus the treatment on preparing that individual for the next step in their journey to a least restrictive environment. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next couple of slides are, we're talking about our new program here, the reevaluation services for felony ISTs. This is a 4-year limited term project, and I like to call this really kind of a stopgap measure to provide us some time for these other investments that we're talking about today to really take root. It takes a while to find providers and to partner with counties and develop contracts and programs. And so, but while we're doing all of that, we have a wait list today, right here and now, and we have over 1,400 people on our wait list who are in need of services. And so this project is really kind of born out of experience that DSH has had during COVID, during the pandemic, and a project that was led by Dr. Warburton and her team, where we were offering what we called sort of this virtual hospital, coming in virtually to re-review updated records of people that were still waiting in jail, try to conduct interviews, provide consultation around psychopharm consultation to the jail medical and mental health providers, doing everything that we could to determine if the individual who was on the wait list may have regained competency while they were waiting prior to transport to a DSH program. And so we sort of took that experience and successfully received some funding to continue this work over the next 4 years. This is really a partnership with the jails to help us with those record reviews, as well as to help facilitate telehealth interviews with individuals that are in the jail. Our focus is going to be on folks that are waiting, have been waiting in jail, waiting on our list for more than 60 days. And it also is building off of experience of work that we already do for other DSH commitments, where we have a whole panel of forensic evaluators, primarily going into the prisons. So we're taking that experience coupled with the work that Dr. Warburton's team has done and building on that, and specific to this IST group. Next slide, please. And so really the forensic evaluators that we're hiring are going to assess folks to see if they may have already restored, or determine if they're unlikely to restore, and go ahead and write that report to the court. And then we're also going to help assess if, perhaps that individual could be a good candidate for diversion or maybe another outpatient treatment program, and try to coordinate that potential file review or referral if a diversion program exists in the community. At least try to flag it for someone's attention so they can take another look. If you recall, one of Dr. Warburton's slide had indicated in kind of our detailed case review, over 40% of individuals that we had reviewed really met that sort of profile and criteria for diversion. Next slide, please. So this, again, next set of slides are really talking about the direct funding opportunities that are going to be made available to counties, as well as, like I said, treatment providers. Just covering jail-based competency treatment. I think most of you are familiar with this. We've really focused a lot of our efforts over the last 5 years around building out JBCT. Again, it is just direct competency restoration, but a way for us to expand the capacity to provide access as quickly as possible. So currently we got over 21, or we have 21 programs and just under 500 beds. And this year's budget funds us for an additional up to another 11 counties and 123 beds. So when all is said and done, we'll have JBCT programs in 32 counties and just over 600 beds. Next slide, please. This is really exciting, an expansion of diversion, even though we're not yet done with our 3-year pilot program for the original DSH Diversion Fund program. Because the magnitude of our problem and a lot of the good work that we've seen to date, we were able to get additional funding to expand this program. And there's really 2 tracks here. So one, there's an expansion of the existing county contracts that we have in place that are tied to the original 1819 authorized funding. So there is funding available to expand those. And then also to open up this opportunity to any other county that we're not currently working with. And so this slide really is kind of going over the details for any new county we're not currently working with. All of the sort of the program structure is exactly the same as our initial pilot program. So the funding is for a 3-year period of time. And our funding assumptions are really based around serving a number of clients that are based on roughly 20 to 30% of the average rate of referrals between fiscal years 17-18 through 19-20. The funding we have made available is a sort of a flat rate of $142,000 per client served. Again, that's over that 3-year period. I should note that the law allows for diversion to be for a period of up to 2 years. There is a county match requirement to these dollars. So depending on the size of your county, it's a 10 to 20% match. And that has to be local dollar. And then in terms of the eligibility criteria for individuals who can be served by this program, the folks have to be either already deemed incompetent to stand trial or likely to be found incompetent to stand trial on a felony charge. There are 3 eligible diagnoses under this program, and that's either schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, or bipolar disorder. The reason why there's a limitation on the diagnoses really has to do with the research. Again, that Dr. Warburton's team had led, that shows us that about 70% or just over that amount of individuals coming into our state hospital system have one of these 3 diagnoses. In addition to that diagnostic criteria, There has to be a linkage or a correlation between the crime and the individual's mental disorder or conditions of homelessness. And then the individual must be able to be safely treated in the community. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is sort of the summary of details for our current county programs. We're currently working with, I believe, 24 counties. In our funding assumption, we all of the counties that we're working with currently, they've identified what their target number of clients to be served over this 3-year period. Our funding assumptions are based on increasing the total number of clients by up to 20% of that contracted amount. It also provides an expansion of the program for an additional 3 years. Funding level still the same, so $142,000 per client. The difference being with the expansion is that we're not requiring that local match with these expansion dollars. The other piece to this is that the funding has to go to serve clients and divert clients who are incompetent to stand trial on our wait list. Again, trying to reduce the wait list and get folks access to treatment as quickly as possible. We have expanded the diagnoses. So beyond the 3 that I just talked about in the last slide, any diagnosis that is eligible under kind of the big broad diversion law, Penal Code 1001.36, is eligible for the diversion program. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just kind of a snapshot to show you the differences. Really, the current counties we work with, the original funding back in 1819 goes through all of the different requirements of the program and who's eligible. That really is a mirror image with the expansion to brand new counties with this year's funding. And then lastly, for those existing counties that we do contract with, the expansion of dollars are targeted on IST, expansion of the diagnoses, and there is no county match required for that. Next slide, please. This is exciting, community-based restoration program. So we have been partnering with Los Angeles County Office of Diversion and Reentry since 2018-19. We started with about 150 bed contract. This is really just sort of adding to what they were already doing for the misdemeanor population. And so, we approached them, loved what they were doing, contracted with them to do more of it for the felony IST population, and eventually got up to 215 beds. This year's budget really expands that program by a significant number of beds, because LA County, they have so many commitments of ISTs. And so we're expanding that program. We've got funding in the budget for 300 additional beds. So it'll be 515 when all is said and done. 200 of those 300 have already been activated by the end of March. And then the other 100 is expected to be activated this fall. But in addition to this, wanting to be able to bring this opportunity to other counties, we did receive funding to contract with up to 17 new counties and up to 252 beds. That's just really based on our funding assumptions, but we still have to kind of work out those details with folks. Funding that we're making available for the expansion of this program is just over $108,000 per bed per year. And in addition to that, we're providing per bed $50,000 one time for program implementation. So that could be helping towards, some retrofitting, helping towards down payment of purchasing of, homes, residences, retrofitting the space, getting that up to sort of, including all those safety features, that the recruitment, the training of new staff to support the program. So we think it's a pretty robust funding package. In addition, I think lessons learned from our implementation of the diversion program, where we had no training dollars budgeted, this time around we have budgeted $100,000 per year that we're going to be making available. It's really funding for DSH to provide training and technical assistance to the counties. I think our focus is really around workforce development and whatever the counties need to support them in activating these programs. The timeline for this is we're on a little bit of a longer timeline in the sense that most of the funding for this new program and establishment of these programs are really in next year's budget. We have a little bit to start if folks are ready to start by spring of this fiscal year. But given all of these different new programs and expansion of programs, we've got a lot of irons in the fire. So this one's on a little bit of a longer track. We're going to start county engagement and talking with either counties or providers beginning in fall of this year. Okay, next slide. All right, and last but not least, this is sort of the IMD subacute capacity program. Again, trying to bring, a broad continuum of treatment options for ISTs in the community. The idea is to here primarily partner directly with treatment providers who can help procure space, expand existing facilities, to treat this population. And so this is really a robust funding package for us in the sense that it provides one time of up to $250 million to support the infrastructure costs. So the purchase, the renovation, of all of that space, and then also provides the funding for the ongoing operation. So once the facility is ready to activate, we also have the ongoing dollars to support a treatment program. And so here we've got a lot of flexibility with this particular program where we can go directly to providers, but we can also work with counties in this space. Just lost my train of thought here. And so what we're focused on, not just competency restoration programs, but also a means towards stabilization to help prepare folks for diversion. So really kind of looking to some flexible programming there to serve the IST population. And then also this is it's also a complement to all the huge investments that are coming out of our sister agencies. Department of Healthcare Services has their $2 billion infrastructure program to build out the behavioral health continuum. And then I believe Social Services has just under $1 billion made available for the adult residential facilities. And so this $250 million is kind of our piece of of all of that, but targeted to the felony IST population. If we can't use all the funds for new programs that are specific to ISTs, we do have flexibility to create some more step-down capacity for individuals who are in our state hospitals and move them into this facility in order to then provide space for ISTs off of the wait list. So next slide, please. All right, so that's it for me. I'll hand it over to Christine Sicati, Chief Counsel, to talk about some of the changes to our penal code and WIC codes that came out as part of this year's budget. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you, Chris. Well, they saved the lawyer for the last, but luckily I only have about 10 minutes or so of slides. And this is a little bit of sort of the wonky in the weeds details about the many changes that did occur to the penal code and the welfare and institution code to enact the programs that Chris spoke to from this year's budget. And then I think either during my presentation or shortly after, we'll probably be opening up the Q&A where you can type in your questions so that at the end of my presentation, then I'll turn it back over to Ashley, who can move through the Q&A. But now is a good time also to, if you have questions, to begin thinking and formulating those, to put them in the Q&A when Ashley opens that up. So I'll start with the changes to the penal code from the reevaluation services new program. that Chris spoke about, she talked about this measure as something that we're doing right now to address the existing wait list. So the statutory changes here, we're adding a new section to the penal code. And this section gives us the authority, the explicit authority to do what we had begun doing during the pandemic, which is to evaluate defendants that are committed to us as ISTs while they still remain in county custody. We saw this work very well, led primarily by Dr. Warburton's shop, and this statutory change just gives us that explicit authority to operate that program. So the penal code provides that the evaluators can assess those IST defendants who still remain in jail to see if they've regained competence, if there's no likelihood that they will regain competence, or whether they just need that further evaluation, perhaps they could participate in a diversion program. It also then amends the Penal Code 1370B1. Those of our justice partners here on the WebEx, our public defenders, our district attorneys, our judges are probably very familiar with the B1 report. That's the report that DSH does 90 days after commitment as to an IST defendant's progress towards restoration of competency. So this amendment to B1 gives us authority to use the report from that evaluation that occurred of the felony IST defendant while in county custody towards that B1 report requirement. So those 90-day reports can include a report from a DSH evaluator who evaluated the IST defendant while they were still at the county. So those reports will consider, whether they've already been restored, whether they need further treatment, or whether involuntary medication remains necessary. Next slide, please. An additional amendment to the penal code to enact this program. It gives us the authority to use the results of those evaluations under 1372. So again, most of our justice partners are familiar with our 1372 certification of restoration of competency that we do right now for all our IST defendants that are committed to DSH and treated in one of our programs. So if our evaluators find that that IST defendant has already restored while they were in county custody, we can use that evaluation to submit that certificate of restoration to the court. And so for those patients that we find that they've already been restored without coming to us, they would remain there in county custody after we file that certificate of restoration. Next slide, please. This is sort of the meat of how this program is going to operate. So we added a new section to the Welfare and Institutions Code, and it really explains the goals and the purposes of this program and how we will run it. So that we can conduct this for any IST defendant who's been waiting longer than 60 days from commitment. And it talks about how DSH will have the authority to get more recent and relevant records. So that will help us perform a really comprehensive evaluation. We really just have those records from the date of commitment. So this makes sure we'll get updated mental health and medical records. It also ensures that we have that access in the jails, and will be a good partnership with the sheriffs to ensure we can access the IST defendants and evaluate them via video to see if they've restored or have not or are not likely to, and gives us the authority to opine on all those subjects listed there in the slide. Next slide, please. It also, the WIC explains that we'll submit a written report from that evaluation to the court, and goes through that this could serve as the 90-day report or the 1372 report. It also ensures that we're being good partners there with our sheriffs, and that we'll reimburse the jail for IT support and staff time. We recognize that this takes time out of everyone's day to transport the IST defendant for that video evaluation, as well as those IT resources. So we'll ensure that we can provide that flat rate to reimburse for that. And then it gives us that explicit authority to make sure that we can get those records to perform a comprehensive evaluation. Next slide, please. This is the statutory change for that diversion expansion that Chris spoke about. So this is amending our existing diversion program in the WIC code section there, 4361. So for our expanded diversion program, as Chris mentioned, those will be only for those declared IST, but it does remove that clinical criteria limitation so that it is not just for those who have schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, or bipolar disorder. It is for a larger range of those who are found IST. And for this expanded program, it eliminates that county funding match. So that the details of that are in that WIC section. Next slide, please. This is the IMD subacute facility funding changes to the statute. It adds a new section to the Welfare and Institution Code, giving us that explicit authority to enter into those contractual arrangements with a wide variety of public or private providers for institutes for mental disease, mental health rehabilitation centers, skilled nursing facilities, community-based restoration programs, and really expands our ability to run these programs and gives us the statutory authority to do that. Next slide, please. So these changes regarding those IST defendants who are found that there's no substantial likelihood they can be restored to competence, and IST defendants who are reaching their maximum commitment time frame. These penal code changes are pretty in the weeds in details, but I'll go over them briefly. But I would encourage folks to take a close look at the statute. So this just clarifies 1370B, that for those IST defendants who we've been treating and we found there's no substantial likelihood they will regain mental competence, or those that are reaching their maximum term, their 90-day maximum, that they need to be returned to the custody of the county as opposed to staying in a DSH bed. So once we submit that report that says they're non-restorable or they're reaching max commitment, within 10 days of receiving that report, they need to be returned back to the county's custody as opposed to staying at DSH. It doesn't require any further orders of the court. This is very similar to how we do 1372 now. They just return, an additional order is not required. And similar to 1372 now, if patients remain in our beds beyond that 10 days, this gives us authority to bill a daily rate for them remaining in those beds beyond their maximum commitment or beyond 10 days from when they found non-restored, which is the same as what we do for our restored patients right now under 1372. Next slide, please. Finally, for misdemeanor ISTs, DSH used to be one of the identified placement options for them to receive competency restoration at our hospitals. And this eliminates DSH as a placement option for those misdemeanants. And instead, that will be up to the counties to determine appropriate clinical environments for those IST defendants to be restored to competency. Next slide. I think I'm done. Yeah. All right, I'll turn it back over to Ashley. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Christine. All right, so we are opening up the Q&A option, so you can send in your questions to us. And as I mentioned at the beginning, here is that photo of what it looks like on your screen. And so if you can please use the question bubble icon and type in your questions there. That would be wonderful, and we will read those out loud in just a moment and direct them to the panelists best suited to answer the question. Just give us one moment to make sure that we all have our Q&As pulled up on our end, and we will get going with this section of the presentation.
So Ashley, the first question will be, will we be sharing the slides? I see several people have asked that question.
Yes, we will be sharing the slides. They will be posted on our public webpage along with the recording of the video, which we should have posted sometime in the next few weeks. I'm going to apologize. I am actually having a few technical difficulties pulling up the Q&A on my side. So give me one moment, please. We're going to have to do this without the shared screen. So first question is, will the state advocate for removal of IMD exclusion rules for the desired facilities so funding is not hindered and would support this effort? Thinking that that may be a question for perhaps our legal team as well as Chris.
I can start off. Well, DSH is, we're not the direct state agency that kind of oversees the licensing and oversight of, community IMDs. We do know that our sister agency, Department of Healthcare Services, is, working towards and looking to the IMD waiver process. But I guess what I did not make clear in my part of the presentation in terms of the funding for IMDs is that we really envision funding this 100%. And so this does not require sort of drawing down a match of funds to support the services in an IMD setting. Hope that's helpful. I don't know, Christine, from a legal perspective, if there's anything to add there.
No, I think you covered it. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Will CONREP have any involvement, such as case management, treatment, prescription, while someone is IST in a community diversion program?
If the IST individual is ordered to the conditional release program, so the statute does allow for ISTs to be, recommended for outpatient treatment to a CONREP program. And so if that individual is ordered to the program, then yes, at that point, the CONREP provider would have involvement in the case management and treatment of the individual. There's very few, I will say there's very few because of the way our CONREP programs have been set up. I think I mentioned very briefly that we are set up like what I consider sort of traditional county behavioral health services. We've got a centralized outpatient clinic. And so folks have to be pretty well stabilized and higher functioning to navigate public transportation and to seek their services in sort of a centralized clinic model. Under our new FACT, as I mentioned, a new level of care that's being established for that program, where we envision that services will be provided on site in the residences where individuals live. It's very possible we can serve more IST defendants in that program. And so in that case, yes, CONREP will have a role there.
Okay, next question. Will new IMD beds be built, or will the state hospitals just be able to take limited IMD beds away from the LPS conservatorship population to provide restoration services?
Yeah, no, we're sensitive to that. We're not seeking to take any beds away. We are looking to expand bed availability. And so we've got the $250 million in one time to invest in infrastructure projects to increase the capacity. And as Christine had mentioned, it's a very flexible list. I mean, it could be the traditional IMD, a mental health rehab center, a SNF, perhaps with an STP designation. And we can also look to expanding more community-based restoration options, even with this funding. So not taking away, we're going to be adding to the inventory of beds.
Next question. What if doubt is declared again after the DSH evaluator determines the person has regained competency? Is there a process in place? Also, will DSH create its own panel of evaluators similar to SVPE/OMD?
I can answer the second question, Christine. I know you're going to answer.
Go ahead. No,
yeah.
you go for that.
This is an additional panel of forensic evaluators similar to the SVPE and OMD. So I mentioned that this is sort of built on experience and work that we already do. So it is another panel. Absolutely. Christine.
Yes, I think in that situation, so there can be a hearing before the court on whether the defendant remains incompetent, even though the DSH has submitted an evaluation finding them now competent. However, if it's a new doubt, we would expect that that would go through the traditional process of getting a clinical assessment, by an alienist and going through that route.
Okay, thank you. So our next question, are there statistics available about what percentage of persons sent to state hospital for restoration are restored versus not restored? And we, I believe, are looking into that. So we will loop back around to this question. And if we aren't able to answer it here live as we're recording, we will send out an email to participants with the answer to that question. Next question, can you provide a cost comparison of IST treatment and outpatient diversion versus in a state hospital?
Yeah, I mean, we can provide some information. I will tell you, right, that our funding levels for diversion, I mentioned we're about 143,000 per client, and that would be up to a 2-year period for that person out in diversion. And our average cost of the state hospital bed, and this is really, if you're looking at what the average cost is for the average time it takes for us to treat an individual and help restore their competency, which is, I don't know, roughly about 160 days or so, I think on average, 150 to 160 days. So based on that average length of stay and kind of our bed costs, it's roughly about $108,000 to treat an IST in a state hospital bed versus what we're sort of funding for diversion. And we're still, I mentioned that we're still kind of in the pilot phase of the initial diversion programs. And so we haven't yet collected enough fiscal data to truly do a deep dive analysis on that.
Okay, next question. What entity would be responsible for paying charges if a defendant remains past the 10 days of notification?
I'll try to take that, although I don't know if I have my fiscal folks on, but it would be the same entity that pays right now for those that exceed 10 days beyond being found competent. So under 1372 right now, we can bill the county for those that remain 10 days beyond that receipt of certificate of restoration. So I'm not exactly sure which county entity pays that, but I can check into it and let you know. But whoever pays that currently would be the county entity. It would be up to the county to determine who pays it, but my presumption would be that that would be who the county would designate for that purpose.
Okay, next question. Will the expanded diagnosis be applicable to the 18-19 population or just the expansion population? And this question is in reference to our DSH diversion program.
It's just to the expansion population and the new dollars. So again, you have to already have a contract in place with us to operate a DSH funded diversion program. And then when if we're providing additional funding for another 20% increase in the number of clients being served, that portion of the population can be any diagnosis under Penal Code 1001.36. So it is a very sort of limited to just the expansion of existing programs.
Okay, next question. If DSH can contract directly for local IMD beds, won't that further constrict local placement options for 1370.01s and diversion candidates?
I mean, I think this speaks to the last question, is that we're not looking to take any beds away. We're looking to increase and build new capacity above the current available inventory.
Okay. Next question. Would you be able to elaborate more on what the IST diversion program looks like once an individual is granted diversion and released? Is it similar to CONREP in terms of specific terms and conditions?
The way that our DSH diversion program is built is it's really unique to each county. You know, we have given sort of overarching guidance and sort of best practices advising the counties as to these are the sort of components of a good diversion program. But at the end of the day, we partner with those counties to help develop their own plans and what works within their own community, along with sort of the behavioral health and justice partners at the table. I do see Kate up, so I don't know if you've got something to add to this.
Well, certainly in terms of the terms and conditions, the patients need to participate and follow the terms and conditions of that program. And I would say from a clinical perspective, you know, our conditional release program has traditionally served folks who are admitted to us because they're too dangerous to be in the community, and that we've mitigated that violence risk to the point where they're stable enough and they no longer pose a threat to the health and safety of other people. So it's a different commitment type generally that goes into CONREP. So it's a different focus and a different program. I think the IST programs, we expect a significant amount of clinical contact.
Okay, next question. For the county diversion programs that are being extended, are you maintaining the rule that the defendant cannot have previously obtained restoration services from DSH on the same case?
Yes.
Okay. Next question. Hello, I am the Community Program Director for OC CONREP. At OC CONREP, we conduct all of the felony custody evaluations. We also have a process for reevaluating those who are waiting for a DSH bed. We treat all of those that are appropriate for community-based treatment in the community at OC CONREP. Any IST that is appropriate is treated in CONREP. My question revolves around what the benefits would be for the community-based IST program, since we do not currently see any unserved.
Well, the benefit to us is we'd love to see more counties offering these services. So I think the Orange County CONREP is one of the few. I think we only have 7 counties that operate a conditional release program. The rest of our CONREP, or the remainder of the state, are actually covered through private contractors. And so not every county program has a program in which they are treating the ISTs in the community. So more the advantage is to be able to bring this opportunity to establish dedicated programs in other counties.
Okay, and there's still been a number of questions just whether or not the PowerPoint presentation will be made available. So I'll just quickly repeat, we will be posting a copy of the PowerPoint presentation as well as a recording of today's webinar on our public website within the next few weeks. Next question, I did not see any dollar amounts or bed counts for IMD bed expansion. Could you please provide figures?
We don't have a total number of beds. We have, as I mentioned, $250 million in infrastructure funds, and then we do have some ongoing funds that are available to support program operations. But we're still in the process of getting sort of a lay of the land of what is the potential available capacity out there, which is why we wrote this proposal and the accompanying statutory authority for it in sort of the most flexible way possible. So I don't have an exact bed count. That's all still remains to be seen. You know, it's our desire to definitely maximize the use of these funds to get as many beds as we can possible. So, and we'd like to see some programs that serve the entirety of the state from far north to, you know, Southern California counties. So apologize, I don't have exact details there, but we'll be as efficient as we can with the use of these dollars.
Okay. Next question. Will telehealth evaluations be conducted as a matter of course following entry of a commitment order?
I'm going to take it, Chris, or do you want to? So the Welfare and Institution Code says that DSH may conduct those evaluations for those that have been on our wait list for more than 60 days. So I believe as we're rolling out the program initially, we will certainly focus on those existing patient populations within the 1,400 person wait list who've been waiting more than 60 days. It doesn't necessarily need to be for every single IST defendant that's on the wait list. It is a permissive option under the statute. And it wouldn't be following the entry of the commitment order. We would, wait until they're more than 60 days. And the reason for that is just clinically speaking, we don't think there's necessarily going to be much change in the clinical presentation less than 60 days. Within that 60 days, there could be services provided in the jail that may have helped that patient, return to competence. But less than 60, I'm not sure that we would really see much change that would warrant that reevaluation. I don't know, Chris, if you had anything to add.
Thank you. Next question. Do you anticipate this impacting access to state hospital beds for LPS conservatees awaiting placement in inpatient hospital beds?
Do you want me to take that one, or? So for the existing LPS beds are governed by the MOU with Cal Mesa, which had recently expired, and we're looking to renew. The prior MOU provided up to 556 beds for the LPS patients. We currently have a census of LPS patients that significantly exceeds that. I believe we're close to over 700. So I think at this time we're focusing on making sure that those folks who are clinically ready for discharge are moved out by the counties to least restrictive placement options. So I do think there is an impact because we cannot admit ISTs when we have so many LPS sitting in those beds beyond the maximum we had allotted.
Thank you. Next question. In addition to the misdemeanor IST population that counties may no longer refer to DSH for competency restoration, did the legislature adopt the governor's proposal to eliminate counties' ability to send LPS civil commitment patients to DSH for treatment?
No.
I can take it, Chris. No, the legislature did not adopt the proposal for DSH to no longer treat LPS patients. So we continue to treat them at this time.
Next question. How will DSH solicit requests for proposals under the new provisions in section WIC Code 4361?
So IMD. We're working directly with providers, again, to 4361.6, Christine Wright is the IMD capacity. We have so many. It's hard to keep up with them. No, we have the latitude to be able to work directly with providers. So right now we're doing kind of an environmental scan, I guess, if you will, of who are the providers out there, what are the possibilities, so that we can kind of take stock on what sort of makes the most sense, so that we can kind of cover, again, get the maximum number of beds, as well as to be able to, equitably have a distribution of beds across the state. So we're just working directly with the providers just to even get the lay of the land out there first.
Okay, sorry about that. That was my confusion on the WIC codes. Next question. If Los Angeles can run a CBR for felony ISTs, why are we not building more of those instead of JBCTs?
It's a good question. Not every county is LA. LA is very progressive, and they've been doing this work for a long time. And so, this year's budget does provide funding for us to start working with counties to build out CBR. It's going to be on a much smaller scale. But, folks, we're trying to meet folks where they are. And so that's the bottom line. And, for me personally, I know jail-based competency treatment isn't the ideal therapeutic setting for our clients. But I do feel that it's an important part of a continuum of different options that are available to serve this population. And so, there's a lot of counties that they felt more comfortable with the jail-based competency treatment, and that's where we started. And so now we're doing the same with the community-based restoration program. We love the work that LA is doing, and so we'd love to see more of that happening in the counties.
Thank you. So it looks like we can circle back very quickly to the earlier question that we had regarding the percentage of ISTs who are restored to competency versus those who are not. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to scroll through a number of questions here to find the actual. Here it is. Are there statistics available about what percentage of persons sent to state hospital for restoration are restored versus not restored?
Yes, we just pulled some data showing we restore 92% of the individuals who are sent to us as incompetent to stand trial.
Ashley, I'm sorry, we may have gotten out of order on these questions. I did see after the question I responded to regarding CBR versus JBCT, Phoebe Bell had asked a question.
I'm going to that next.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I circled back to an earlier question that we pulled data for. So our next question is, if your evaluation of someone in custody finds that they are eligible for diversion, will you submit that to the courts? How do we work with our courts to accept the risk of community level treatment of people? Our courts and DA are very risk adverse, which leads to a lack of interest in community-based treatment.
Kate, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, we are in our initial evaluation or our reevaluation commenting on whether or not that person meets the eligibility criteria. We're not doing a diversion eligibility evaluation, but we are signaling those patients who should be reevaluated.
Right, and so that is a part of the report that the evaluator will do, and it's essentially just an assessment, a recommendation that if there is a county-run diversion program, we think that this patient may be eligible for it, and is encouraging the counties to explore that option for the patient. I don't know, Chris, if you want to speak to the other questions, but I think we can use models where we see diversion being very successful in those counties to partner with counties that may be more risk adverse to see how that has rolled out in their county. I know we have several very successful counties whose programs, probably welcome to speak to other counties to see how they can partner and bring that to fruition in their own county.
Yeah, I guess I should also say, community-based restoration, we define it very loosely compared to maybe what folks in the counties see as community-based treatment. For us, anything outside of DSH is community-based treatment, essentially. And so the funding that we provide to LA County, they actually do have a continuum. They put some, it's not a huge number of of their more costly beds, but they do utilize some acute inpatient beds at their local county hospital, as well as some IMD beds. The majority, though, are unsecured residences, again, where treatment is delivered on site there. That is like the majority of the beds. But they do have a bit of a continuum there to help people move directly from jail, stabilize, and down to some lower levels of care. So, I think it again, it's going to be unique to each county, what the comfort level is. And so again, I think our package of funding is trying to be as flexible as possible to meet kind of counties where they're at in their journey and acceptance of serving this population in the least restrictive environment.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Could you provide some examples of what types of facility retrofitting that the program would assist in? Also, is there a cap for assistance?
We haven't established a cap at this point. Again, trying to take stock in an inventory of what potential projects are out there for us. But really it's, you know, I think what we envisioned is, can we fund, say, a new wing of an existing MHRC? You know, we've talked to a couple providers who have already completed plans for potential expansion of facilities. Is that something we can partner on to help fund, right? And then retrofitting would be, you know, is there a vacant building out there that's decertified, unlicensed, and really just needs to be brought back to life, so that it can be licensed and certified again. And so we're pretty flexible again in terms of what that will look like, again, depending on what the cost. So sorry not to give like very specific examples, but I think the point being is that we're aiming for some flexibility in order to get some of these programs going.
Okay, next question. Isn't the high dismissal rates of ISTs returned to court a function of the long stays? Many defendants have so much credit that holding a trial is of little utility.
I think for that, we would look at whether those low-level offenders that have less sentence time, whether they really need to be served in a state hospital setting or whether they could be more appropriately served in a community-based program or via diversion. I think we need to make sure that we are getting folks who really need the highest level of care into DSH, that locked institutional level of care, and trying to find more appropriate placements for low-level offenders. So it may be a consequence of that, but with the programs, continuing to move forward and expand, I hope that, we see less of that. I don't know, Kate, if you had anything to add on that, or Chris.
Okay. Next question. In our county, we don't have interim placements for individuals pending 1370 C2 LPS investigations. Will the state support the county in creating capacity for this population? Our judges release this population directly to the community, which leads to recidivism. Also, can the state hospital system change its policy of refusing to supply LPS investigation? This would expedite the quest for alternative local placement at the point of 1370 C2.
I think, we have our existing statutory authority, and our existing statutory authority does not support placement of the population that's undergoing conservatorship investigations. That's a county responsibility under the statute, and has been before these changes, and continues to be. Also, I think, DSH refers but does not investigate that. That remains a county responsibility. I am not aware of any direction of policy changes to further expand into investigation as opposed to referral at this time.
Okay, next question. The Welfare and Institutions Code changes allows for DSH to potentially move LPS conservatees. Also, if you establish contracts at the subacute facilities. Do you anticipate moving these clients also to provide additional capacity for the felony ISTs?
Yeah, that's an option that we've provided to in order to create some capacity. I will say that our focus currently is IST, direct IST capacity. So that's what we're prioritizing. But we've given ourselves that flexibility in order to really explore all potential options. So it'd be sort of last on the list, but we do have the ability to do that.
Next question. Has DSH considered incentivizing counties to fully implement mental health diversion by utilizing the fact that a county has a robust mental health diversion program as a factor in determining rank on the admissions waitlist?
So I think it would be hard to operationalize. I don't know. I'm looking at Chris. I'm not sure how we would operationalize that with a wait list of 1,400. It would be a struggle. Our existing regulations provide that we admit patients in order of commitment date, and that's to ensure fair access and equal access to the state hospital beds across all counties. yeah, it's something I would need to take a look at it. It would be very difficult, I think, to manage a wait list in that fashion, but it's a good question.
Yeah, it's an interesting question.
Okay, next question. Regarding the percentages of charges being dropped for some felony ISTs, does your research indicate that the reason for the charges being dropped was due to the felony IST being conserved?
Unfortunately, we don't have that level of granularity with that data.
Okay, next question. Do counties need to apply for any of these program improvements, or will they be rolled out automatically? For example, community-based restoration program beds.
Yeah, we, we've had conversations with a number of counties directly, but we, especially for the new opportunities, we will be sort of calling out letters of interest to get sort of a scan of what counties are interested in the funding opportunity, and we'll go from there. But we don't have a formalized application process for these funds.
Okay, next question. This is a two-parter. For patients awaiting transport to DSH that you engage virtually at county jail, how much time do you spend with the individual? What are the observations, evaluation tools you have available to you? And how is this different from a patient admitted to DSH?
That's a great question. And this is an evolving program. The actual evaluations themselves are taking about 90 minutes to 2 hours. And depending on the evaluator, each evaluator has their competency assessment tool of choice, but they're using generally accepted competency evaluation tools. So the reevaluation service thus far has provided a benefit in that we're finding maybe 1 in 3 to 1 in 4 of the individuals we're evaluating, it has stabilized to the point where they're already competent, and that comports with long-term UC Davis data on the admission work that they've done. So that's something that we would do at the state hospital too, is identify the people who've already been restored. Secondarily, the most important function that these reevaluations have served thus far is identifying the barrier to competency. And this is exactly what we do when someone comes into the hospital. And for most patients, the barrier to competency is the symptoms of psychosis from a schizophrenia spectrum disorder. And so the most important intervention, I often say there's nothing magical that we do at the Department of State Hospitals. The primary function that we do is stabilize people on antipsychotic medication until their psychotic symptoms remit, at which point the barrier to competency is usually removed. And so we are offering at that point a psychopharmacology consultation. We're not on staff at the jail, so we can't go in and prescribe, but we can do everything within our power to support the providers at the jail in prescribing for that person. And each evaluation has the contact information for our psychopharmacology consulting service so that can happen and get that person stabilized. We have also identified just a small handful of people who are not incompetent because of a serious mental illness. We've identified people who have serious medical conditions or neurodegenerative conditions that would render them not truly IST, but unrestorable in the case of a neurodegenerative disorder. One thing that we have shown over time is that approximately 17% of the people that we're admitting as incompetent to stand trial are feigning or exaggerating symptoms of a mental illness in order to avoid adjudication. And that's a little bit tricky. There is a national conversation going on with forensic evaluators about the methodologies for determining feigning of symptoms, and there's a evidence-based building but that's another service that we can offer with the virtual hospital. And of course, identifying, as I mentioned before, those people who got arrested because they were symptomatic and homeless, who would be stable in the community if they were medicated, so that those folks can go ahead and get a diversion evaluation. So while we can't be the folks to actually deliver that psychotropic medication, we can support the jail in delivering the same type of psychopharmacology that we would do in the hospital.
Thank you, Dr. Warburton. Our next question is another question just about the new facilities through the IMD proposal. We have answered a few questions about that already, so I'm going to go ahead to the next question, which is, what is the state hospital system trying to do to coordinate care with county jails to prevent bounce back?
I don't know, Kate, if you have any insight on this. I think, our focus has always been to try to support jails and continuing to maintain defendants' competence. I know Dr. Warburton has personally reached out to many jail systems to try to provide those psychopharmacology consultations she's discussed. And we always, continue to provide education to counties, district attorneys, and public defenders in the courts on the available options under the statute for involuntary medication and to maintain patients on involuntary medication. So I think I don't want to speak for Dr. Warburton, but one of the things we see clinically is just that maintaining that medication compliance is really critical to maintaining competence, as well as moving to trial as quickly as possible or the next phase, so that defendants don't wait in jail an inordinate amount of time after we return them.
Just to add on to that, if I could, as the doctor on the team, if I could wave a magic wand and change one thing, it would be that anyone who's in jail with an involuntary medication order is stabilized and maintained on an appropriate schedule of psychopharmacology.
Okay, next question. Is DSH willing to evaluate the antipsychotic medication needs of ISTs sitting in jail and provide training for involuntary medication for this population?
Look, Kate, your wish is granted.
Yes and yes. And when we're doing the reevaluations, we are doing an IMO evaluation. I should have mentioned that, but we are opining about whether or not the person meets the threshold for an IMO. We are, as I just mentioned, providing every report with contact information to contact our psychopharmacology resource network. And we have already started coming in and doing trainings. There's a lot of mythology around involuntary medication. I think for folks who haven't done it, it is a barrier to overcome. But in most cases, providing involuntary medication is usually just telling the patient they have an IMO, at which point they take their medication. So, but yes, we're happy to come to any county and provide that training, and we're happy to remote in virtually and do an IMO evaluation.
Next question. Is the subacute IMD funding for departments or to directly contract with CBOs?
It can be for counties in addition to private providers. We're starting with the private providers because most often it is usually that a CBO is running that facility, but we can entertain working directly with counties.
Next question. Do state hospitals anticipate any impacts on the number of LPS beds at state hospitals due to the issues with the flood of IST patients?
I think we answered this one earlier. Thanks, Josh.
Next question. If the court rejects a 1372 certification that occurs after an evaluation in the jail, will the committed individual maintain their position on the waitlist based on the initial date of commitment?
Yeah, I think we'll have to assess that as the law rolls out and determine how we will prioritize that person on the wait list. We'll need to look at our existing regulations and make a determination on that.
Next question. How can an individual be considered restored without having been transported and without having received any restoration of competency treatment or training?
Well, that's a good question. You know, there's really nothing in the literature to support the concept of competency training. As I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of people that we admit are incompetent due to their psychotic symptoms, meaning they're delusional or hallucinating or disorganized to the point where they don't understand the proceedings against them and cannot cooperate with their attorney. Once we get them medicated and those psychotic symptoms remit, those folks are restored to competency, and that's something that you don't need to come into a state hospital to do. Competency training is really, it's not necessary to restore the majority of IST patients in our experience, and that is supported by the literature.
Next question. Will DSH be requesting for any restored felony ISTs to stay at the state hospital so they can remain competent?
I think that already exists under 1372E in very limited circumstances and based only upon a recommendation by the hospital medical director. But again, I think our focus of this presentation is on the stress and strain on the limited beds available at DSH. So we need to partner with all our counties to try to maintain the competence of IST defendants once they return to county custody so that we can continue to admit we don't have enough beds to have everyone stay here until they proceed to trial. There's a limited circumstance under 1372E that does provide for that, though.
Next question. At the last meeting, you said we could use expansion dollars for housing. Housing is pricey. 20% of our current grant would not even scratch the surface of housing. Is there additional funding for housing for our DSH grant population?
Not under the DSH diversion program. The funding levels remain the same, but it still stands that they can be used flexibly and towards housing. Now, if we're talking about establishing a separate program such as community-based restoration, there could be some additional dollars through that program to support housing. But for the DSH diversion program, all of the sort of the funding methodology remains the same.
Next question. Will DSH engage in quality control with regard to IST restoration programs at the local level? Will DSH seek to replicate the quality of service provided by the state at the local level?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely, we will be providing guidance, oversight, training, technical assistance to any county, or, if it happens to be more of a private organization that's providing the service on behalf of the county, we will be engaged in an oversight capacity to ensure the quality of the program.
Next question. On the slide regarding primary diagnoses of individuals declared IST, Dr. Warburton noted that over the time span of the study that substance use as a primary diagnosis had not increased. Is there any data on the number or percentage of individuals with co-occurring or secondary diagnosis of substance use?
I don't have that at my fingertips, Tyler. I can look into it with our research team and get back to you.
Okay, next question. And this is a follow-up to an earlier question about the diversion program. Has there been any discussion about removing the requirement, the rule that you cannot divert individuals who have received restoration services at DSH on their current case? From our experience with our DSH diversion program, this requirement excludes many deserving candidates.
You can divert folks after they've been restored, but utilizing the county's available resources. But we're endeavoring to keep our funding streams separate because they are separate programs, right? And so the point with our diversion program is to connect folks into mental health services while they either to one, mitigate that IST commitment, right, to prevent that from even happening, or two, help relieve pressure from our wait list. And so if they're passing through one of our existing programs, have regained competency, and then are moving into a DSH diversion program that sort of it sort of defeats the point of why we have established these programs. But certainly they can be diverted utilizing, again, the county's available resources.
Next question. Are there any funds available for expanding current JBCT programs?
Yes, we do have. We have in the budget funding to work with up to another 11 counties and expand beds by over 100. I think it was 132 beds. We can also look to expanding existing JBCT programs as another measure, as opposed to just establishing all brand new programs. So we do have some flexibility there.
Great, next question. Is there a plan for service expansion after community reentry to prevent recidivism and revolving door IST placements?
All of our funding opportunities at this point that have been identified are really specific to direct IST treatment. Now, diversion is one of those programs, and the whole intent of that is, right, to connect into ongoing mental health services after the term of diversion, but we're not directly funding reentry services after the commitment.
Next question. How are the DSH evaluations conducted regarding the diversion question? How long does it take for a county behavioral health court to receive an evaluation?
We are not doing diversion evaluations in our re-evaluation service. What we're doing is we are flagging patients who in general meet the intent of our diversion program. That is, they are psychotic, they are unsheltered or homeless. There's indication in the police report that the crime was driven by their symptoms or their homelessness status. You know, a lot of the crimes that we see are trespassing, people looking for shelter, and people who, when we look at their criminal arrest history and the arrest report, would potentially not be a significant danger once medicated. So in our review of the forensic file and the jail psychiatric records and the interview with the patient, we are simply flagging for the court that this person should be considered for a diversion evaluation, but we are not doing that ourselves. However, our diversion program funding can be used for those diversion evaluations.
Okay, thank you. Next question. And this is a follow-up to Phoebe Bell's question earlier about community-based restoration programs when you have more conservative justice partners. Will there be targeted discussions or trainings with the court and district attorneys who lean toward care at a state hospital?
We're happy to do trainings and consultation with whoever would like it. I have gone to the CDAA, the District Attorneys Association, at their invitation twice now, and found them very receptive to what we're talking about. So anybody who wants a consultation or a training, just let us know.
Yeah, and we're working, you know, Ashley is working very hard along with Darcy and the team to develop a curriculum of trainings that we're going to be focused on with respect to our diversion program, but similar, we're going to take a very similar approach with the community-based restoration programming. I mean, the targeted training will be a little bit different there, but it's all based on being as responsive as we can to the requests that we do receive for training. So that's, I think, a really good recommendation.
Okay, next question. For our risk-averse judges and DAs, do you have any facts and figures on recidivism for those who participate in CBR versus DSH and or JBCT restoration?
No, Kate, I mean, not immediately, right? Because we're just launching it. As far as the Department of State Hospital, right, we're just now launching into expansion of the community-based restoration programs to the counties, and it's all going to depend on what the structure of those programs and how that what that looks like. I mean, certainly we can work with our LA partners to get some information, but again, their environment is going to look very different than, you know, perhaps some of the new programs that do come up in the county. So not immediately.
And from a clinical perspective, you know, all three of those programs, for the most part, are simply based on that restoration piece. They're not based on interrupting the cycle of criminalization or stabilizing that person for a warm handoff to a long-term comprehensive mental health program. So I would imagine they wouldn't be appreciably different unless there was some selection criteria differentiating them in the first place.
Okay, next question. How did you reach the conclusion in your 2-month study that the unsheltered individuals did not have criminogenic factors driving their behavior? For example, a co-occurring antisocial personality disorder.
I don't think we've reached any conclusions. I think we've gathered data and developed hypotheses. We did one brief 2-month study interviewing patients to ascertain their status related to being sheltered, but the research has been ongoing for 13 years. I think what we're saying is that when we look at the files of people who are being arrested and found incompetent on a felony IST charge, about half of them you can ascertain from the arrest report that because they were symptomatic and unsheltered, that was directly related to that person being arrested. Further work with that individual would have to be done to do a risk assessment and other things. But what we're saying is we're identifying that in roughly half of the patients, these are the factors that appear to be most proximally related to the arrest itself.
Thank you. Next question. What percentage of your IST patients have a diagnosis other than bipolar, schizophrenia, or schizoaffective disorder, i.e. the other diagnoses in PC 101.36?
That's a good question, Jonathan. And I think the major lesson that was learned from, you know, we think about over 70% of the individuals coming to us have some type of bona fide psychotic disorder. We know roughly 17% are feigning or exaggerating the symptoms of their mental illness. We have a small subset of people who have some sort of cognitive issue. But the lesson we learned from winnowing it down to those 3 diagnoses is we were missing a whole cohort of people who are being diagnosed with an unspecified schizophrenia spectrum disorder because there's not enough data available to the evaluator to make a definitive, you know, schizophrenia versus schizoaffective disorder. So I can look into diagnostic data and break it down for you because we have that. But what we're really trying to do is target those people who have primary psychotic disorders. And that's at least 70% of the people we're admitting.
Okay, next question. What percentage of your IST admissions arrive at the hospital after sitting in a jail for up to 4 months in an unmedicated state?
That's a good question. And we've been trying for a long time to find a way to ascertain that. The problem that we run into is we don't have information on, we can see on the jail psychiatric records if they've been prescribed medication, but we don't get information on whether they're taking medication and whether they're taking it regularly, et cetera. So we've not been able to take a more quantitative scientific approach to that, but just anecdotally, we've been reading hundreds of jail psychiatric records, and there are a lot of people, I would say the majority of people, sitting without medicine in jail.
Okay, that was our last question that we have in the queue right now. So we still have 5 minutes left. If you have any last questions that you would like to enter in the Q&A, if you could do that now, that would be appreciated. I do want to repeat, we've had a couple more questions just about the availability of slides. And just to repeat, these slides will be made available along with the recording of today's webinar on our public webpage, which is www.dsh.ca.gov. And it should be posted within the next couple of weeks. So be on the lookout for that. And we will give it maybe 1 more minute to see if we get any last questions in before we end today's webinar. Okay, well, seeing no more questions, I'd like to say thank you all for joining us today to hear about the various programs that we've received funding for this fiscal year related to the IST issues that we are all facing together as a state. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at any time, and we will do our best to respond the best way that we can to that. Also, just another reminder and plug, there is the Public IST Solutions Work Group meeting that is scheduled for next Tuesday, August 17th from 10 a.m. to noon. And there's more information about that meeting and that work group on the California Health and Human Services website. So if you are interested in that, you can go to that website to check out more information about that. Anybody else on the panel have anything to add before we close out the webinar?
No, thank you for your time, everybody. We had a huge turnout today. I think we had pretty close to 400 people register. And we had, I don't know, maybe over close to 300 actually attend today's session. So really appreciate everybody's interest in all of the various opportunities and strategies that we have to try to address this problem. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great Friday and a great weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.